You are listening to the Gospel of Peace podcast. This is a podcast for kingdom women and everyone else about political theology and everyday faith. My name is Rebekah, and I'm a PhD student discovering what the gospel of peace has to teach us in a world full of violence, fundamentalism, abuse, nationalism, and more. I am so excited to finally sit down and record this podcast. I basically have been thinking about this concept since spring in the midst of a very busy semester in graduate school, doing various classes and seminars. I kept coming back to this concept, and it really sprung out at me from Ephesians 6:15. And with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. What does this mean? We often don't think about the gospel as being a gospel of peace. We think of it as a gospel of forgiveness, of salvation, and all these things are really important. But if we miss out on the fact that it is a gospel of peace, that it brings to us like peace in our hearts, healing and wholeness and shalom, that is basically like it's not just the absence of conflict or war, it's a state of wholeness. And we really, really need this wholeness in a world that's full of brokenness, and honestly, in a Christianity that isn't very whole sometimes, that leaves us very broken. With fundamentalism and legalism and all that, it just leaves us shattered. It leaves us like shells of human beings sometimes when you go through the kind of spiritual turmoil that comes about from various forms of legalism, spiritual abuse, etc. And in the evangelical world, there's this whole like performative spirituality, and I'm going to talk about that in a future episode. But just to say, like, devotionalism, just to say that what we think God demands of us is often counter to the very gospel of peace. Why? Because the gospel of peace, like, literally, is like the Psalm 23. He is our good shepherd. We shall not want. He leads us into green pastures besides the still waters. And then Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." A lot of Christianity and evangelicalism and what we understand about holiness, about discipleship, about radical devotion to God, all these things lead us not into the still waters, the green pastures, into rest. It actually causes us to labor and become heavy laden. And there is that message throughout evangelicalism that I think, like, our understanding of spirituality, as in how we understand our relationship to God and how we enact that, how we practice that, is often very burdensome. It's often about just doing the hardest and most difficult thing, and thinking that as long as we're taking the difficult road, that is the narrow way. Not necessarily. Those are not necessarily the same things. Like, if in the days of like the Israelites and Canaan, if like putting yourself on an altar or sacrificing your children was considered like the ultimate sacrifice to show your devotion to God, it doesn't mean that God asks us for that kind of destructive devotion or Stockholm spirituality, because maybe God doesn't ask that, and maybe obedience is realizing that, hey, we need to stop and ask ourselves what God actually wants. God as a loving father, Jesus as a good shepherd. What do they actually want? What is obedience? Obedience is not just cooking up difficult things to do in our mind. I have two articles about that. One is about spiritualized self-destruction, and the second is about, the title is "God Was My Abuser Until the Father Stepped In." So be sure to check those out. Those are written out. They're pretty long essays. And one of the reasons I decided to start this podcast was because I have a lot of essays, and sometimes they need to be talked about, like a little bit more studied. In terms, a lot of my essays are research articles, or I put together research from a textbook here, an academic journal article there, and I've been putting that into a series called the Kingdom Outpost Studies series. And that hasn't really gotten much traction. I think that having this article or excerpt to read and then having like questions and discussions about it in text form just creates more reading. And so I thought, let's give that project a try, but in like video and audio form. Maybe that's just like a better way to have a conversation, because I share a lot of those things to start conversations, but we're not really having conversations. So this podcast is a combination of several different things. Several years earlier, we had this thing called the Kingdom Women's Podcast, but a lot of the ladies have gotten really busy, and we have not had a third season to that podcast, but you can go and listen back to that. Seasons 1 and 2, we had 6 or 7 different Kingdom Women, and we had some guests as well talk about everything from submission to beauty to but you might think, oh my goodness, that sounds like stuff that will bring up like bad experiences and thoughts, but totally not at all, because we're just having honest conversations about these concepts. A lot of the ladies on the podcast are like Anabaptist Mennonite ladies who are way older than I am, so we learned so much just talking about these things together, working through those concepts, and definitely like outside the fundamentalist box. And many of the other ladies on the podcast are amazing advocates in the field of abuse, such as domestic violence. So we also talked about gentle parenting, about missions, just a whole bunch of different things. They often talked about marriage. I was just part of listening into that conversation. And so this podcast is a little bit of continuation of that. I really wanted to engage women, especially in discussions of theology. Like so many Christian materials for women, like women are really passionate about their faith. Just down the road here in Kroger's, or if I go even to like Dollar Tree or Five Below, there's so many like prayer journals, devotional books, Bibles for women. Clearly, women really care about their faith, and that's a good thing. But there's a huge gap between women and some of the media theology discussions. And I get it, like the structure, the entire thing is built with women on the outside. And so like these conversations, it's not like I'm trying to bring women to the traditional field of theology and say, you have to be a part of that, and that's really important for your spiritual life. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm saying that there are a lot of interesting and meaty discussions, materials, resources out there. As a person who is in academia, as a PhD student, I get to access all of these, and I think, oh, wow, that would be so meaningful to have a conversation about. Most of this podcast will not just be me just spouting off on ideas. There will be guests, but I don't want this to be an interview-heavy podcast. This will be a podcast responding to and discussing literature a lot of the time, including blog posts, books, articles, devotional books for women. There's so much to sort of dig in and digest from those. And also things like I'm thinking of discussing chapters of Robert Friedman's Theology of Anabaptism. There's a really good book for an upcoming episode that I really want to discuss, because I am working through these materials and through these books, and I'm thinking, wow, I just wish that more of us could have discussion with that. And so that book is about the Lord's Supper, but it also has a chapter about 1 Corinthians 11 and the head covering. And I'm going to bring in some like Greco-Roman sources about virginity. And so that will probably be episode 2 or 3, because I'm super excited about that. I know it's a little clickbaity to have a podcast that's, one of the first episodes is about the head covering. Like, boy, is that a topic that people really want to talk about and listen to, even, yeah. So that is coming up. I am so looking forward to that, because this scholar, who is a Baptist scholar, did an amazing study on the significance of the historical significance of the Christian banquet table, the Lord's Supper, what it means for 1 Corinthians 11 to say that like women pray and prophesy with their heads covered. So much fun. And so most of the time you can expect to be listening to me on this podcast. I will have guests when I can arrange to have them. And I will also be referencing, sort of bringing together the Kingdom Outpost study series. And let me think, I also have a Medium page. Some of my articles are there when they're less part of the Kingdom Outpost mission, when they're more like responding maybe to current events or to current discussions or thoughts that are in the works. I often put them in my own Medium page, medium.com/@Rebekah Mui, REBKHMUI. I'll put a link to that. And I'm also on Twitter. We have a lot of fiery and sort of like the edgier discussions, shorter bits of things go on Twitter. The brief sort of contemporary or up to date, or not to say, well, things that engage more with the Twitter sphere in longer form, I put my Medium. And then there's the Kingdom Outpost. The Kingdom Outpost is basically a project talking about Jesus's kingdom, the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of peace from an Anabaptist perspective. We really do want to have more writers on there, and I've always been trying to get more writers to contribute. We have a lot of different podcasts that we bring together, such as That Jesus podcast, the Fourth Way podcast, Asher Whitmer's Unfeigned Christianity, Anabaptist Perspectives, trying to think, Strength to Strength, Think Truth. So these are podcasts from across the Anabaptist/Kingdom theology world that we bring together, create this podcast kind of network thing. And we share articles from individuals across that world as well. And if you sort of look up the Kingdom Outpost and you find that you are in line with more of, I guess, what this, like the world that we are interacting with for the Kingdom Outpost, it's largely a conservative Anabaptist world. And so our mission statement, our goals, or our statement of beliefs and values kind of aligns to that. So I think we actually mentioned the head covering in our statement of beliefs, which is really interesting. But that is what our community is, of podcasts, of writers, of people who are involved in the conversations. And I find that my Medium and Twitter, I'm engaging a lot more with a wider world, which I really, really love. And this podcast kind of brings together all of that. I'm like not ashamed of who I am as a person. I do tend to lean more conservative, but I also like, I am also thinking through and processing a lot of things with my friends in the like a more conservative community about things like fundamentalism and abuse. And I just love the conversations that we are having. For me, it was one of the first communities where I really felt like it was a safe place to have these kinds of conversations, that people even were interested in the conversations, that they had insights. And yeah, that, like, it really just opened up so much for me. And so I love that community that we have through the Outposts and through the various friends that I have made along the way. So just a little bit about myself, because people are always curious, and you kind of have to give like the what elevator pitch, like how do I summarize, which parts of it do I pick, to sort of explain why I am the way I am now, where I am the way I am. I would kind of have to start with where I come from. I come from Southeast Asia, Malaysia specifically. I always grew up in a very Christian home. We were mainly like a mix between Arminian and Methodist, but also like charismatic and evangelical. There's sort of influences, like my parents would have been very influenced by things like Peter Wagner, Derek Prince, like the charismatic teachings of like the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And so I would say that uh, like my family, our Methodist slash Arminian heritage is something that I very, very much appreciate. That's where I come from. And I'm not apologetic about that at all. That when I was a child, I think I wrote down my diary because I was always interested in theology. And my grandpa always encouraged me to borrow books from his library because he was a good minister who researched his sermons. He loved learning and research, and he's still alive. And I think if he has we don't exactly know what it is, but he definitely has memory struggles. And so he doesn't quite, like, we can't really have a conversation about a lot of these things. But I do remember that he always encouraged me to read books about theology. He loved hymns and singing hymns. And so he encouraged that. And I remember writing down in my diary at a very early age that I am an Arminian. When I was about 17, I did write down in my diary that I am an Anabaptist. That's what I have decided that I agree with, even though I had questions about non-resistance specifically, which is the Anabaptist political theology in relation to like violence and politics. Because the question that I wrote down was like, what about someone like Bonhoeffer? What about when it's evil that's happening to your neighbors? How do you stand in the way of evil? Which is a conversation that many of my Anabaptist friends have. I had somehow gotten a hold of Harold Bender's Anabaptist vision. That was the only like Anabaptist teaching that I could find online as a teenager. I was very interested in learning about theology, learning about faith, and that at that point for me it was a lot about like radical faith, like people who weren't conformed to this world, who really pursued Jesus. Let me just pull this out here. So if you're watching via video, you can see this is a little pamphlet that I got called the Anabaptist Vision. One of the things that really like stuck out to me as I was reading through this pamphlet again was I had not noticed this before, but apparently Anabaptists used to be called like the Bolsheviks of the Reformation, which is literally one of the funniest things I've ever heard. But Anabaptists were always these radicals, and that is what attracted me to them. But there was so little information about them. I couldn't find much about theology. I did find some things about pietist theology, which interested me as well, because at that time I was interested in pursuing like spiritual disciplines. The pietists were all about that devotion to God and spiritual disciplines. And I read a little bit of that. I kind of decided that I was Anabaptist. Again, there was very little that was out there at that time. So that was pursuing my own faith. The problem was that I was seeing in the various ministries that had impacted our church during the early 2010s that a lot of abuse was surfacing. And I talk about this in a recent article on Shiny Happy People, the documentary about the Duggards and Bill Gothard and the Institute of Basic Life Principles. We had a lot of influence from that was brought into our country and spread mainly in evangelical circles. It was very much its own thing, but it was also very congruent with mainstream evangelicalism. And that actually was spread pretty widely in Asia. Our church, I talk about it in the article, so I'm not going to repeat it, but we had a lot of theology that was not even theology, like teachings, applications, laws that were not really taught as laws, like convictions or family choices, but, a lot of things. Our church went through a lot at that time as a house church, as a church that practiced, speaking in tongues and charismatic things, that had influence from like charismatic extreme like healing theology. Not even, I know it's not a theology, it's like legalism, like doctors, medicine, any little antibiotic pill, vaccines, all those like somehow emblematized a lack of faith in God. And there was also, and I think a lot of kids who grew up Pentecostal charismatic can really identify with like that thing where demons could be everywhere, and you kind of have to be really careful. You got to burn a lot of stuff. You've got to stay away from Harry Potter and Pokemon and soft toys and just whatever could possibly have demons, and you've got to cast them out, and you've got to really be on your guard. So there was, a lot of, I believe there's a lot of legalism and fundamentalism in those charismatic circles as well, not just in the Gothard circles, though there's a lot of overlap. I mean, the whole thing with like Cabbage Patch dolls being filled with demons or whatever it is, like that whole demonology and that like looking for devils under every stone. Anyway, so I do have that article that recently came out on that, and it was actually published on the Roy's Report, which was great because we need to be having these conversations. Like there were a lot. I had a friend who grew up in a very, very charismatic household. Like these are not people who wore clothes even as conservative as the Duckers, but she said like she had no exposure to media at all. Everything was demonic. Everything, like, if sometimes for a child in those kinds of charismatic settings, let's say you really like this particular toy, and then your parents might decide that that toy is giving you demons and is the reason for some behavior that they don't like in you, so they'll burn it. Maybe I read about people who experience their parents literally like dismembering and mutilating dolls and then burning them, which is not extreme. It's not crazy. Like this stuff, like the whole D&D scare in the 70s, that was pretty mainstream in evangelicalism. Like it wasn't some like oddly dressed ultra conservative sect that had all these kinds of like rules and paranoias and superstitions. How did I get on this subject? So anyway, that was certainly a part. Like I don't think I had a lot of personal trauma from that happening in my home specifically, but it was definitely in the church culture. And I say that it got so bad that I know people who literally died from preventable diseases because they believed that any kind of medical care, medical precaution, or anything of that sort was like a lack of faith. And of course, like faith is you can't be saved without faith. And so it didn't necessarily contradict the classic Protestant formula of sola fide, but saved by faith alone. They would still all affirm that while teaching a lot of extra biblical rules that really literally killed people. So in the early 2010s, I just kind of like was really done. I had been so passionate about my faith. I had dedicated so much of my time pursuing what I was really passionate about, which was scripture, memorizing, reading, theology, devotion, and faith, and then just seeing all that abuse and seeing no one speak up about the abuse. There were people online on like Recovering Grace and Homeschoolers Anonymous, but a lot of this came from like not a Christian perspective. And while I totally like really, really, really appreciated the insight and the thinking and just how they helped me really process things as they were being taught, as they were happening, I was already questioning them. But those came from a non like a post-Christian, ex-Christian, non-Christian perspective, which is fine. Like that's totally legitimate, and I think we should listen to those perspectives a lot more. But I was just facing such a crisis that I kind of just put a stop to it all. I put a pin on it for like 7 years. I was not really big into church going. We had a church at home with my family, but if I was a student overseas, I was not like super into church going at all, really, maybe once or twice. I definitely could not and would not go anywhere near a charismatic church service. Sorry. I think the gifts of the Spirit and all that, like amazing and necessary. I would not go like to an evangelical service. When I lived as a student in Ireland, the only kind of church that I felt like I would even want to go just to experience was a Anglican service. And there was some calm familiarity because they were so similar to the services and liturgy that my grandpa would how do you say, officiate? That's not quite the right word. The services that he would have in his church. Like I remember him doing communion liturgy when I visited. That was what I experienced. I didn't feel a connection necessarily to those things. Like I know some people really, really love liturgy. Not me so much. Like I don't love it, but it felt safe. Like it wasn't the abusive stuff. It wasn't the toxic stuff. It wasn't stuff that I didn't have any connection to. And even now, like if I'm not visiting a Mennonite church, I'm most likely visiting an Anglican church. The thing about those is just that where I am and where I was is that I don't need that every single week. I don't need that all the time. But anyway, and so I put a pin on it. Like I put my radical devotionalism and whatever else that I wanted out of the way, because there are so many questions I had in my mind, so many things I wanted to process, and I didn't have anybody to process it with, to discuss those questions, until 2016 rolled around. And I realized that a lot of the charismatic stuff and a lot of the like fundamentalist IBLP, Gothard, fundamentalist homeschooling, conservative type stuff, there was a similarity in that both of these were heavily embroiled in Christian nationalism. And like the hypocrisy, the ability to neglect just sweep away the sins of church leaders and political leaders, and all of that kind of like, wow, that was not surprising because I knew it had been a thread there all along, but it really just came out of the woodwork and was very much in your face. So I saw all that happening. And I think that if I had not already started departing from that world, I could easily have been one of those people who, like, that is their world, that is their Christianity. Christianity means having this political view. It means supporting certain Christian political leaders, so-called Christian political leaders, or who support Christian political causes. Like everything was embroiled, neatly tied together in this world. And like my education, the charismatic influences, the fundamentalist homeschool influences, all of those things would have pushed me into that world, except that I had already walked away from that because of all the abuse and the lack of recognition that abuse was even an issue, the authoritarianism, the toxic theology, just like all of that. I was done with that. And then seeing even the few Christian like authors, podcasts, or Christian influences, preachers, whatever, that I listened to, just get sucked into that. I was like, no, I'm done with that as well. Even these more mainstream, not culty, not weird, but they kind of got into, like, that was their only political theology, that was the only worldview. In about 2018, I started making friends with different Anabaptists. And so happened the Anabaptists and Mennonites, particularly, that I met were those who were ardently speaking out against things like Christian nationalism and abuse. These are the two things that really drew me into that. They were like the first Christians that I had met who were actively speaking out and who speaking out against and who recognized when theology and abuse really came together. And they were pretty much like central to Anabaptist theology is this concept of the kingdom of God that's a separate kingdom from the kingdom of this world. And that leads to the Anabaptist belief of not trying to gain political power, not participating in worldly politics, as they would say, but also pursuing peace. Not that was a larger, wider thing, like the view of how we relate to politics, how we relate to power and to violence, that really drew me in. I'm like, oh, I did believe this at one time. I didn't really understand all of it. I started listening to Anabaptist perspectives videos. I really found a community of people who actually do care about and who are faithful to the kingdom theology. Just because someone has it in their statement of faith does not actually mean that they haven't been sucked into that, because sucked into the milieu of the Christian nationalist authoritarian world, because it's so easy. It's culturally there. And I know, because in my teenage culture growing up, even not in America, it was there all along. It's part of the very structure and makeup and background and like the furniture of the Christianity that many of us grow up in is Christian nationalist, because we're not given it might not be explicitly Christian nationalist, but the problem is that we are not given a solid biblical interpretation, a solid understanding of why that is not the case. Like, you can like say, okay, well, nobody in our church is going to be talking about politics because it's divisive, but everybody can hold to their own political, but yes, everybody should like hold to, their own views and not push it on other people. But there has to be a way of understanding scripture and understanding our relationship to power and politics and abuse and hierarchy and all that, that should be, at least for someone like me, I need a framework of understanding. I need a theology, because the theology is not necessarily like this highfalutin thing. Theology could be very practical. It's an understanding, a framework, an interpretation, a doctrine. We need this, I think, at least I do. And so I kind of got into that. We started the Kingdom Outpost at kingdomoutpost.org. We've continued to have these conversations, and I was starting to research colonialism and empire. One of my Kingdom Anabaptist, actually, I'll call him a conservative Mennonite, Vichy Amish friend, Titus, who started that Jesus podcast, wanted me to research and talk about colonialism. I had actually not understood or known very much about it. And so when I started learning about it, it became like my thing. Everybody would invite me to talk about colonialism or ask me about it, because that was the topic of interest, and it still is. I started that project in 2018, and it's been 2018, 19, 20, 21, 22, 25 years. That has been, and finally I realized that I could do this as a dissertation project. I spent the entire pandemic applying to different graduate schools and programs, not really finding one that fit and that I had the qualifications for, but here I am in an interdisciplinary PhD program, essentially doing a theological / social / post-colonial project about the gospel of peace, looking at Anabaptism and Anabaptist kingdom theology and empire, the world's empires. And it's an incredible privilege to be able to work on a project like this. So I think that we don't want this podcast to be too terribly long. So I just kind of want to end here, I think, having talked a little bit about my story. To me, the gospel of peace is, again, like a gospel that shines light into the darkness of things like abuse, fundamentalism, nationalist idolatry, imperialism. There's so much. I want to do an episode, and I had all my notes prepared, on the gospel of peace being a soteriology, that is a gospel of salvation, and talking about lust, sinful desire, in a different way. Sinful desire and the lust, as being the desire to take from and to harm others. Like Jesus said, the thief comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. So I think that will be an upcoming episode, and another upcoming episode will be about the imperialism of the Roman banquet, the Christian banquet in response, like as a subversion of that, and in the context of that, like womanhood, head covering, the like virginity cults of the early Greco-Roman thing. So I will be engaging with a lot of literature in this podcast, working through discussing writings so that we bring in other people's perspectives. It's not just me like going on a solo rant or just spouting off my ideas. It really is listening to and engaging with literature, bringing other perspectives, research, history into that. And some of this will be critical in the sense of we might engage with like toxic spirituality, books that are written to women, devotions that I just like, no. That is part of the problem. I have actually a podcast by Leslie Ludy on people pleasing that I want to talk about in an upcoming episode, because she literally says that, we have to, following Jesus, the Bible commands us to apparently accommodate ourselves to the opinions of others and always put ourselves second. So there's stuff to get into there, just to give you a preview of things that are going to be covered. And I look forward to having more discussions, bringing together like social, political, theological streams of thought, and seeing really the patterns, the frameworks, the similarities, realizing that violence and abuse, like on the scale like war and on a scale like domestic violence, essentially operate using the same principles and concepts. So there we go. Thank you for listening so far. I really hope that you will comment, send in your thoughts. I'll figure out a way for you to do that, because we want to have conversations about what the gospel of peace means in the world today. What is a kingdom worldview versus the very politicized biblical worldview, for example? I'll see all of you in the next episode, and God bless.